one of the things that people ask quite frequently is why personal narratives, and specifically the refugee narrative, is important. The truth is it's a very layered question, so it has to be broken down in a couple of parts. So how do you explain this to people? I did what everyone would do. I went on Google, and these are the results online if you type in refugee and Hong Kong. So let's just have a moment to just take in what's being said. Think about the word choice. When people say words like fake refugee problem, bad name, does that stir up fear? When you see the words camps or deportation, does that give a sense of reassurance? Do you feel affected by these headlines and wonder, whether there is actually a refugee crisis in Hong Kong? Wherever you sit on the political divide, it is unequivocal that these headlines use extremely evocative language designed to stir up a reaction. So let's have a think. The things that are being suggested here suggest that Hong Kong is overrun by refugees. There's a refugee problem. It insinuates perhaps that this is a new problem occurring in Hong Kong. And thirdly, perhaps people wonder whether there's any sort of responsibility that Hong Kong owes refugees and asylum seekers in Hong Kong. So, of course, with any sort of headline, you need statistics or metrics to quantify your understanding. So, in the global case, there's 68.5 million people displaced worldwide. So in Hong Kong, we actually have one of the smallest refugee and asylum seeker populations, only around 11,000 people. Hong Kong has a population of 7 million. There is one country in the world that has a similar gross population to Hong Kong, Lebanon. Lebanon has actually taken over 1 million Syrian refugees. So you think about in Hong Kong, the actual proportion of refugees in the population is less than 0.3%. It's around 0.2%. And of those that are seeking asylum, the success rate is 0.7%. So this auditorium probably, would house about 200 people. That's basically the amount of people that have been successful in their asylum claim. So the next thing about refugees being a new issue in Hong Kong, that is patently untrue. The fact is, many of you sitting in the audience today would not be here had your grandparents or parents not sought asylum. This narrative is in my family. My grandparents left mainland China in the 50s after the Chinese Civil War because they were on the wrong side. They were on the nationalist side, the losing side. It was no longer safe to be in mainland China. They were in fear for their life. They were part of this metric of 1 million people. They built Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not a city overrun by refugees. On the contrary, it is a city built by refugees. Some of the most prominent businessmen are refugees. So the last thing about obligations. So Hong Kong has not signed the Refugee Convention, which is the international human rights instrument that protects refugees and recognizes their status. It has, on the other hand, recognized the Convention Against Torture. One of the things that the anti-refugee movement in Hong Kong has said is, well, why don't we just stop them from coming? Why don't we just stop our obligations under the Refugee Convention? The Refugee Convention is obviously the instrument that you think about, but the Convention Against Torture, that's something that affects your human rights. All of us sitting here today, all of us in Hong Kong, if we're a Hong Kong ID card holder, the Convention Against Torture affects us just as much as it affects Form 8 holders, otherwise known as asylum seekers. The fact is, the Convention Against Torture is the international human rights guarantee that you will not be taken from your bed in the middle of the night. It is the treaty that stops you from being detained falsely imprisoned, being forced to make a confession, having your nails ripped out. It's the international protection that stops you from being subject to cruel and inhumane treatment. It's astounding, right? To think that you would be ready to throw away something so important to all of us in the name of protecting Hong Kong from a so-called refugee problem. And this gets back to the point that often in the face of the unknown, often in the face of uncertainty, people will act in ways that go against their best interests. So the thing is, yes, we can go through the headlines, we can go through the metrics. We can also talk about the law and policy. All of that is important. But the thing is, law and policy doesn't really change minds overnight. I would know, actually, because I'm actually a lawyer by training. And when I did my legal training in Australia, I worked in a community legal centre where we gave free legal assistance to refugees, new migrants who had been in Australia for less than 10 years. So basically, people would come to us when they had any housing dispute, contractual issues. Basically, they were desperate. They had just arrived in Australia, many didn't speak English, and they just needed some assistance. The thing that actually stuck with me, though, which made me actually think whether law was the right path for me, was the part that actually made the most sense was I spoke to many refugees and asylum seekers who were clients. One of the things that I had to do was just talk about their experience and about the assistance that they'd been afforded and whether they were satisfied with it. And universally, all of them said that, yeah, you know, we really are appreciative that you've helped us, but the fact remains that we are not liked here. Like, people don't want to listen to us. People don't want to see us as human beings, and all we want to do is connect with the wider community. So Australia has a patchy human rights record as well, which is the reason why you get a lot of xenophobic press around refugees. It's another reason why there's not more public outcry about the offshore detention in Manus and Nauru. But getting back to Hong Kong, I moved here for work. I was still interested in doing something with the refugee community, but I spent a long time thinking about the infrastructure that already existed, because the last thing that anyone needs is creating a new movement that doesn't need to be there. I spent a long time looking at how refugees were written about and the grassroots projects and movements that existed, and disappointingly, there were very few. Yes, there were a couple of NGOs that operate in Hong Kong, but they work in an extremely hostile environment. The thing is, one of the things that was very stark is I saw headlines like the one that I showed you, and I sort of felt that there'd never really been any collaboration or consultation with the community. No one had ever been asked, you know, what their story was. And the issue is, when you have such xenophobic headlines, on the flip side, you might have ventures into poverty porn, of which there's a lot. People like to have stories about suffering, but there's never any call to action or agency given to people. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. Table of Two Cities started in late 2016, and with a small group of volunteers, we started working with one of the refugee-led societies in Hong Kong just to see if any of the members were interested in sharing their story through the medium of food. So all we did in the beginning was workshop the stories, so it ranged from stories of just harrowing circumstances or more mundane and sort of light looks into people's lives in Hong Kong. And it was important for us to show the whole plethora of these sorts of experiences. You don't cherry pick people's stories to suit your own agenda. You give the power of narrative. So the thing is, sure, you know, collecting stories, recording recipes, great. It's still something that we do, but it doesn't really change people's minds. The fact is, people want something tangible to do, and in order to change perceptions, you have to give a platform. You have to give people agency to take the stage and do something for themselves. And in fact, in many ways, you hold the space but you don't center yourself in it. So that's how we started to do more community events in Hong Kong, actively collaborating with refugees, activists, students, to see the best way to meaningfully engage two sides of a broken Hong Kong. That's where the name Table of Two Cities came from. It was recognizing that we are a city where essentially there are two cities within, the rich and affluent and the poor and marginalized, who coexist but rarely meet. Food is such a great and powerful tool to bring sides of a broken society together because it's something so universal. It tells stories without words. It's something that we all need as humans. So that's why we have been trying to do more of these sorts of events to give people agency to control what they want to do. We've collaborated with mainly artistic movements, and so here are some photos from our annual observance of World Refugee Day. There's any number of things that we could continue to do. The fact is, having a collaborative mindset, having the goal in mind to give agency back to people is just so important. The fact is, stories of refugees and the narrative around refugees, it's not the narrative of foreigners or aliens, because as I've said, so many of us are descended of refugees. It's the stories of us. And therefore, the narrative needs to be respected. It needs to be honored. When someone gives you the gift of their story, you must make the most of it. You must give them the agency to push forward and advocate for themselves.